Hi everyone. 11 years ago, Tehelka broke a seminal investigation into corruption in defense procurement. On March 13, 2001, we went public with Operation West End, which caught several army officers, functionaries of the Defense Ministry, Bangaru Laxman, who was the president of the BJP, Jai Jaitley, who was president of the Samta Party and was part of the NDA coalition. Many other people were all caught on tape, on hidden camera, willing to accept bribes from Tehelka journalists posing as arms dealers in return for passing them on up the food chain to sell their products to the Indian Army. There were many fallouts to that story. Today, when Bangaru Laxman has been convicted by a lower court, many people have called and asked whether Tehelka sees this as a victory. I'd like to state that we don't see it as a victory because the investigation and the story was not really done against an enemy. We do see it as a vindication, however, and I use that word with care because at the time, apart from the findings of the story, the real scandal was the reaction of the political establishment to the story. They reacted with rage, anger, with a storm of false propaganda against Tehelka, a witch hunt that shut Tehelka down. They jailed Tehelka's investor. They unleashed the ED, the CBI, the income tax. Cases were filed against all of us. And Tehelka was trapped into a commission of inquiry where the government introduced a clause that was unprecedented in the history of commission inquiries. It was called Clause D, and it sought to look into the motives of Tehelka. In effect, that turned the commission of inquiry again into an inquiry against Tehelka rather than the findings of corruptions that was caught on the Sting camera. All the people who were caught on tape were ranged against Tehelka, and for 2.5 years, Tehelka did nothing but fight to prove its story and to defend and stand by its story in the Venkatswamy Commission of Inquiry. Today, when Bangaru Laxman, who's only one of the many convictions, there have been a series of army officers in the past who have also been convicted, some of them court-martialed, many of them have been given sentences of 3 to 4 years of rigorous imprisonment. All of these are vindications of the story because so many questions were raised by the government at that time about the veracity and authenticity of the story and the agenda and motives of Tehelka. We stated then and we state again now that we had absolutely no personal agenda against any individual or even any political dispensation. At that time and even now, we continued to say that our exposure was about systemic corruption in defense procurement. Our desire was to create systemic checks and balances, and that repeatedly we asserted that the cast of characters who happened to be caught on camera were in a sense incidental, because if the time changed, if the political dispensation changed, in many ways there would be another cast of characters possibly caught in the same circumstances, because the corruption was endemic and systemic. The fact that barely 2 or 3 weeks ago, General V.K. Singh, the chief of our army staff, claimed that he had been made a bribe offer by a defense dealer in his own office shows just how brazen and with what impunity that kind of corruption has gone on. So the message that really comes through, both with Bangaru Laxman's conviction and 11 years later, Tehelka had to pay a very huge price. We were shut down. We came back into existence. We relaunched ourselves under very difficult circumstances. The journey to exist has been very difficult over these last 7 or 8 years since we were relaunched. So the real message is the fact that when there is exposure, how should political establishments behave? And that is the real message of Operation West End. The real message then should be that when there is exposure, governments are within their rights to ask whether these findings are authentic. But once you can corroborate that, the reaction should be one of ethical discourse to say that we will act, we will put in the checks and balances, we will punish those who were found guilty, and we will act according to the brief and the constitutional duties that we have been elected for. And then many of these exposures will cease to be the kind of gross political embarrassment that they tend to become. Because when you tend to hide or to lie about exposures by authentic and bona fide journalists, the scandal can only escalate. As I said earlier, the price of journalism Tehelka has paid. We paid very dearly for the investigation, but we stood by it, we defended it, And we have continued to do that with all the stories that we put out in the public domain. And that is the biggest message of journalism, that the buck does have to stop with the editorial establishment that puts the story out and has to stand by it, and also willing to be part of the legal proceedings that arise out of a story. Tehelka cooperated thoroughly with every aspect of the case that came up out of our journalism. Till today, Anirudh Behel, Samuel Matthew, Tarun Tejpal, the key people who were involved with that investigation still go to the courts, they still testify in the cases, they are still party to all the legal proceedings that rose out of it, and that we see to be as much a part of responsible journalism as the exposure itself. Thanks so much for listening in.